So some of the most inspiring stories we've had in craft chocolate over the last couple of years have been our Ukrainian craft chocolate makers. We started with Stranger, who are amazing chocolate makers, and we've had them now for a couple of years. We've now also got Sisters, and we've also got Meetty now as well. And we use this as an opportunity to celebrate Felicity Spector's great new book on Ukraine and cooking and bread, to hold a small impromptu Ukrainian craft chocolate tasting. It was really successful. We're going to hold another one now, along with some Ukrainian vodka from Dina in October. So please have a look at that. And we've also now got a bunch of great craft chocolate boxes on Ukraine too. But it's given us a chance to basically think a little bit about what's so special about Ukrainian craft chocolate, put it in the overall context of chocolate in the Ukraine, but also then compare it to the extraordinary hypocrisy and the really pretty unpalatable stuff that big chocolate's been going on and doing in Russia, basically exploiting the war. So 3 sections. First, just the amazing history of chocolate in Ukraine, including the extraordinary story of one of Zelensky's predecessors, who may well be a successor at some point, Poroshenko, who is the chocolate king of Ukraine. Then talk a little bit more about craft chocolate in Ukraine and some of the great makers we've got and just how encouraging and inspiring they are. And then finally, just to draw attention to the appalling behaviour of a bunch of big chocolate makers. In particular, a few have basically seen this as an opportunity to expand their sales. So despite the fact they're all saying that they're going to pull out and disinvest and do everything, a lot of them really aren't doing anything of that sort. So we've done a detailed deep dive onto what big chocolate's doing in Russia because it's pretty unpalatable. Right, let's start with the history of Ukraine and chocolate. So the first time we come across chocolate really hitting Ukraine in the big time is in Lviv back in 1803 when a Swiss Italian opens up Andreoli, his little chocolate shop. And in fact, it does so well that the whole street becomes known as Andreoli Way. And it really kicks off an affair which just doesn't stop for the next couple of hundred years. So Lviv at one point is right up there with Vienna, with Budapest as being one of the great capitals of chocolate. And despite all of the trials and tribulations of the Russian invasion and takeover of Ukraine during the war, it actually somehow or other builds upon that. So Ukraine actually becomes the chocolate capital, if you like, of Russia. It becomes quite well known. There are a number of brands which do quite well. And actually, when Ukraine reestablishes itself with the dissolution of the USSR, there is a massive sort of run to quality, which is the second phase that we're going to talk about in a moment with the history of chocolate in Ukraine. So what happens with Ukraine is that a guy called Poroshenko spots an opportunity to knit together a bunch of the old Soviet-era chocolate factories, some of which have still got brand names which are recognized today. And he builds this extraordinary powerful empire, which is like at least 500 million, some people say 800 million euros. It's extraordinarily successful. And off the back of this, he actually becomes president of Ukraine. I'm not going to get into all the intricacies here, but he and Zelensky are still fighting it out. And Poroshenko's position with Roshan is pretty extraordinary because on the one hand, he's fighting it out in Ukraine. On the other hand, he's also fighting it out in Russia because Russia's nicked some of his factories there too. But it is a pretty extraordinary story. At the same time as all of this is happening, let's move on to the second part of our story, which is the extraordinary story of Ukrainian craft chocolate. So Ukrainian craft chocolate is really inspiring. The first guys who we got to know were Stranger. This is thanks to Bjorn and Julia of Mike and Becky, who've done an amazing job of supporting all craft chocolate in Ukraine. But we've got to know them now over the last 4 or 5 years. They started in an extraordinary way. They started because they were doing a project on packaging. And as part of the packaging, they tried to redesign the packaging for a chocolate bar. And they noticed how terrible the chocolate bar was. They dug in a bit more and realized that not only was it just full of sugar, but also that the cocoa, what little there was there, was doing the planet no good and also using child slave labor and everything. So they basically got into craft chocolate. And they are just amazingly great craft chocolate makers. But actually they're predated by great friends of Felicity Spector, Alexei and Dmitry, who are basically of Meetty, and they were one of the first people to get into craft chocolate in Ukraine, probably the first actually. So back in the 2000s, Ukraine, like elsewhere in Europe, suddenly started to get into craft coffee, craft breads, etc. And Dmitry and Alexei basically saw the chance to get into craft chocolate. And so they imported their own machinery, And they've done an amazing job. So Dimitri's basically night job, his main job at the moment, is basically up there spotting drones, Russian missiles, and shooting those down. And then he commutes back to his factory where his brother and he are basically producing these amazing chocolate bars. And then the third group we've got, who we were actually very fortunate to have met, we met the wonderful sisters, and as you probably won't be surprised to know, they are a pair of sisters, and they have won lots of awards too. And they're all extraordinary stories. The heroism, basically the way these kids and these people basically managed to get machinery in, the way they managed to get beans in, and then they managed to still get them out to us, is just inspiring. And it contrasts pretty appallingly with Big Chocolate's appalling behaviour in Russia. So the third section I want to talk about is the stuff that I really wasn't aware of until I did a bit of a dive into it, which is what's happened to all these planned boycotts, what's happened to all these people who said they were going to basically pull out of their operations inside Russia. The answer is there are a few who've done the right thing. So we know that Lindt has done the right thing, Olam has done the right thing too. They're one of the big suppliers of beans and chocolate couverture to everybody in the world. But the majority of Big Chocolate players have sort of talked a good name, but actually done appallingly. We've got Mondelez, and so they are the owners of Cadbury's, of Milka, of Toblerone, Oreos, etc. So they at first, towed the party line and said, well, we're not going to do anything. Then they sort of came back a bit and started to talk about, well, we've got to think about our workers there and everything else. And then their CEO came out with the most wonderful quote, which I'm just going to read to you. This is Dirk van der Put, basically said that there has been no shareholder pressure whatsoever to leave Russia, and investors do not morally care about continued business in the country. So they've just carried on as usual. Now, there have been lots of people who've complained about this, but basically it's business as usual. Nestle, initially, same reaction, a little bit more nuanced, then at least not coming out with quite such an explicit, we're just about the money guys, as in Mondelez. But even worse than those guys is arguably Ferrero Rocher, who basically, despite promising not to do any more advertising, despite promising not to export, etc., have just been merrily exporting. In fact, it's one of their biggest growth markets. Now, you can't get much out of them. They're another family-owned company, but basically they seem to have taken the view that, this is a good chance for them to expand, and that's what they're doing. Mars, again, they're using the argument that they have to protect their position, they have to protect their workers. It doesn't look as if they're deliberately trying to expand or do lots more advertising. So it's different with them. We do have a little bit of good news. As I sort of said, there have been a couple of people who basically pulled out. On the consumer side, the two people who basically did pull out are Lindt and Hershey. And then if we switch to Big Chocolate, basically in the sense of supplying couverture, well, Olam pulled out. But having said that, you've got to be a little bit cynical as to why Olam pulled out, which is that Russia was tiny for them. They were less than 1%, according to investor internal reports. Callebaut, completely different set of stories. So Callebaut's second biggest sort of operation for teaching chefs and people how to cook has always been Moscow, and they're certainly not going to be pulling out of that soon, and they are basically expanding and doing what they can. There's been lots of criticism for what they're doing. They've been put on lots of different sort of routes there, but fundamentally they are basically just trying to make money where they can, and it's pretty unpalatable. Cargill, so Cargill have actually been a bit more candid. Cargill are also well aware of the fact that they've also had large grain operations in Ukraine, so that may be what they're doing. But they are not being quite as sort of, cynical, I would say, as the likes of Ferrero Rocher, or as far as I can tell, as to what Callebaut are doing there. So Callebaut are up there on being basically, one of the international sponsors. Their products have been found in ration kits of Russians, so the Ukrainians are deeply, deeply unhappy about this. So what's the summary of all this sort of stuff? So look, again, this is sort of David versus Goliath, but with a bit of a twist to it. So Ukrainian craft chocolate makers, hats off. You guys are just awesome. Thank you, sisters. Thank you, Stranger, Tatiana, Razan. Thank you, Meetty, Dmitry, Alexei. Really, really, really thank you for your amazing, amazing work. If you need any other reason not to have some Nutella or Ferrero Rocher, just look at what those guys are doing in Russia. And similarly, Callebaut, yes, I know you've got a big operation that you've got to defend inside Russia, but candidly, there are times when there should be some principles. Thank you.